This is Lecture 16, Manifest Destiny in the 1840s. This is an iconic picture that represents manifest destiny. This development that took place in America before the American Civil War. Look at the picture. Look at some of the characteristics of the picture. People are traveling from east to west. We see the natives, the buffalo. We see the Conestogas, Americans, farmers, maybe miners. We see the railroad. We see telegraph wires. Okay, a Bible. Of course, train in the back, steamships, etc. American development, farmers. By the end of this lecture, you'll understand this picture a little bit more. Manifest destiny was a term first coined by John L. O'Sullivan. He's the one that used this term that became popular in America in the 1840s. The basic idea of manifest destiny is this idea that Americans should settle the West all the way to the Pacific Ocean, acquire as much of the continent as possible. That this was God's plan to spread our religion, to spread American ideas, and for our children to occupy in the future. Look at the quote by John L. O'Sullivan up here at the top. Our manifest destiny is to overspread the continent allotted by providence, that would be God, for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. We're growing. We're blessed by God. It's His intention for us to occupy the continent. So the causes of this idea, a very popular idea amongst Americans and American politicians, the causes, of course, were to spread American ideas and values, but the biggest cause of manifest destiny is for economic opportunities, economic gain. This is the heart of the Industrial Revolution. And with industry comes a need for resources. With industry comes a need for markets. Get people to buy our goods, our textiles. So this was a big reason behind manifest destiny. And especially moving out west to the Pacific. That gives us access to Asia, specifically China. And the trade that can emerge there can mean a lot of wealth for America. The election of 1844, the Democratic Party nominee James K. Polk, he ran on a platform of manifest destiny. That's what he preached. That's what he promoted. That was his platform, manifest destiny. The Whig was Henry Clay. The Whigs were kind of divided about manifest destiny. The Whigs were concerned about, acquiring land to the west and whether they would have slaves or not. And there was one political party, a third political party, that ran just on the idea to not allow slavery in any new territories. They were called the Liberty Party. A third political party that wanted to stop the spread of slavery. They did not gain many votes in this election, and the winner would be James K. Polk. And he would be known as the Manifest Destiny president. So if any time in a test or essay question, James K. Polk comes out, you need to think manifest destiny. That's what we remember him for. One of his objectives was to acquire Texas, to allow Texas to join the Union. If you remember, Texas was an independent nation, a republic. They revolted against Mexico. They wanted to be part of America, but the first couple of presidents were not sold on the idea. James K. Polk wanted to acquire Texas. And we would acquire Texas, but right before James K. Polk took office, John Tyler would be our president. And he would add Texas right before James K. Polk became president. Now, this is important. Acquiring Texas hurt our relationship with Mexico. Mexico was resentful about that because to Mexico, Texas was rightfully theirs. Another objective of James K. Polk was to acquire Oregon, to finalize and acquire Oregon and establish a border uh, between what part of the Oregon country would be ours and what part would belong to the British. Americans had been making their way to Oregon since the 1700s along the Oregon Trail. You can see that over here in the map. Jedediah Smith was a pioneer, was a mountain man that helped to explore and to create, to blaze the Oregon Trail. It's a picture of him down here in the corner fighting a grizzly bear. You know, he was a man of legend, Jedediah Smith, the famous pioneer who helped to blaze the Oregon Trail. During his campaign, James K. Polk used this slogan, used this platform, 5440 or fight. James K. Polk, meaning he wanted the border, the coordinates of Oregon to be 5440 or we should fight England for it. Well, to a degree, he achieved his objective. We negotiated a treaty with England, Great Britain. The Oregon Treaty was signed in 1846. And the map over here, pretty much along the 49th parallel, would be our border, where we acquired a little bit more of the initial Oregon territory between us and England, which of course would be a part of modern-day Canada. Now, the biggest event in terms of manifest destiny, so acquiring Texas was an example of manifest destiny. Adding Texas to America was manifest destiny. Finalizing Oregon, acquiring the Oregon territory, that was an example of manifest destiny. But the biggest event of James K. Polk's presidency would have to deal with California. James K. Polk wanted California, which belonged to Mexico, because of its access to the Pacific Ocean, especially trade to Asia. James K. Polk attempted to buy California from Mexico, but Mexico refused. You can attribute some of that to the resentment over Texas. That would not stop James K. Polk. We would go to war. And this is important for you to remember because my students get confused in this. We would go to war with Mexico for the rights to California, not Texas. What's going to happen in Texas is an event that's going to spark this war. Texas is already ours. After Mexico refused to sell America California, James K. Polk is going to take advantage of a boundary dispute, a border dispute with Mexico. The dispute has to deal with two rivers, the Nueces River and the Rio Grande rivers, along the border of Texas and Mexico. Follow me over here to the right. The lower border down here would be the Rio Grande River, and the blue would be the Nueces River. So here's your dispute. To Mexico, when they made the agreement with Sam Houston, with the agreement to allow Texas to be created as a settlement, to Mexico, that border of Texas was up here at the Nueces River. In the eyes of Mexico, the border was at the Nueces River. As Texas grew as a settlement, Texans settled beyond the Nueces River all the way up to the Rio Grande River. And to the Texans, they recognized the Rio Grande River as a border with Mexico. So here's what James K. Polk did. James K. Polk sent troops across the Nueces River into the Nueces Strip to see what kind of action Mexico would take. Well, shots were fired in 1846 between Mexican troops and the American troops in the Nueces Strip. James K. Polk would ask Congress for a declaration of war against Mexico, arguing that Mexicans shot at Americans in American land. The Whigs came out against the war. Why were the Whigs against this war? Because they knew California or maybe other lands would bring about again this dilemma of slavery and the extension of slavery. They called themselves conscience Whigs in Congress that opposed the war. One of those conscience Whigs was a very young Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln, on the floor of Congress, promoted these spot resolutions. He wanted to debate, he wanted to investigate exactly where shots were fired that started this war. Okay, conscience Whigs, those that opposed the war, Whigs that opposed the war. One of those was Abraham Lincoln. He led this fight for spot resolutions, which were debates and investigations in Congress to discover where the shots were fired, really in a way to try to prevent this war. But they failed. Henry David Thoreau, the famous American writer, is remembered as an American that protested this war by refusing to pay his taxes. This war is going to last 2 years. The industrialization of America, our troops, our weapons, our capabilities were superior to Mexico. We would defeat Mexico. We would invade Mexico City and force an end to the war within 2 years. In forcing an end to the war, the United States and Mexico signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, which officially ended the Mexican-American War. The provisions of this treaty: America acquired California, and so much more. We acquired modern-day New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Nevada. We also paid Mexico, I guess you could say, some compensation, some money for this land. $15 million. When you look at the map over here to the right, we literally, from winning this war, took about half of Mexico, half of what belonged to Mexico. But in acquiring this land, the issue of slavery was ignited again. And this is what the Whigs feared, and especially American Northerners, Northern politicians, because with all of this land came this debate yet again. Would slavery exist in the new territories? Would they be free states or slave states, and what would it take? That's why many consider that the Mexican War contributed to the Civil War, that there's a direct connection. And that connection is because with the new land came the debate: would slavery be extended to these territories? And right away at the end of the war, you could already see this debate take place. Northerners in the House of Representatives promoted the Wilmot Proviso in 1848. Northern Northerners in Congress, House of Representatives, promoted the Wilmot Proviso in 1848. It was a quick bill that they put together that called for no slavery in the land acquired from Mexico. It didn't pass. It only upset the South, who saw the opportunity to allow the growth of slave states. So once again, the picture represents America expanding out west and what comes with it. And there wasn't a lot that opposed expansion out west. There wasn't a lot of these conscious Americans that represented what was happening. We were continually pushing the natives and their way of life off the land. We, in a very controversial way, took land from Mexico to expand our way of life. And of course, with the angel here, we believed it was God's intention. But you need to know the argument against manifest destiny is the fact that these actions, do they represent what our Constitution is about? Do they represent what our Declaration of Independence is about? Self-rule, equality, and so forth. So you can definitely argue that these very actions that we were doing went against the ideas that America was built on. Manifest destiny. So number one, analyze factors that led to American expansion in the 1840s, really the causes of manifest destiny. Number two, to what extent was President James K. Polk successful in achieving his political goals during his presidency? Remember, he was the manifest destiny president. How good of a manifest destiny president was he? What are your examples? And how did this expansion intensify sectionalism or create division between the North and the South?